I knew letting him eat that bread was a mistake, because the moment his eyes met mine, something in my life shifted, and I didn't know how to stop it. The oven timer had just gone off when the bell above the bakery door rang. That sharp, tinny sound cut straight through the quiet like a warning I didn't understand yet. I flinched, my hands already moving on instinct, pulling the thick oven mitts tighter around my wrists as heat rolled out toward me. The bread inside was perfect, golden crusts cracked just right, the smell rich and alive. The kind of smell that usually made people smile. The kind that usually made me smile. But that morning, my chest was tight before I even turned around. I was still dusted with flour, white smudges on my cheeks and forearms, hair pulled back too loosely because I'd rushed again. Always rushing. Always late. My heart was already racing, not from the heat, but from the clock ticking too loudly in my head. I was late for my second job. Late meant docked pay. Docked pay meant rent that was due in 3 days, looming like a quiet threat. The smell of yeast and warmth clung to the air, thick and comforting, the only thing in my life that still felt reliable. Bread rose when you gave it time. Dough responded when you treated it gently. It made sense. Unlike people. Unlike love. Unlike the way everything had started slipping through my fingers since the breakup, since the bills started stacking like accusations on my kitchen table. I told myself to breathe. Then I turned toward the door. And he walked in. Not rushed. Not apologetic. Not unsure. He didn't say hello. Didn't glance at the menu board. Didn't smile in that awkward way people do when they realize they're early. He just stood there. Tall. Still. Silent. A dark coat hugged his frame despite the early heat of the morning, despite the way sweat already gathered at my collarbone. It was wrong somehow, like he didn't belong to the same temperature as the rest of the world. His presence didn't just fill the bakery. It swallowed it. The air shifted, thickened, like it had learned to hold its breath out of respect or fear. For one suspended second, everything froze. The hum of the fridge. The ticking clock above the sink. The distant noise of traffic outside. All of it dulled beneath the weight of him standing there. I remember thinking, why does he look hungry in a way that has nothing to do with food? Not the casual hunger of someone who skipped breakfast. Not impatience. It was deeper. Quieter. The kind that sat behind his eyes, dark and restrained, like something starved for more than it was allowed to take. My instinct screamed at me to say something. To do my job. To control the space that was mine. "I'm not open yet," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. Too thin. I wiped my hands on my apron even though they weren't really dirty anymore, just to give myself something to do. Something grounding. I lifted my chin, trying to look braver than I felt, trying not to show how my pulse had jumped the moment his attention shifted fully to me. His eyes lifted slowly. Not startled. Not defensive. Deliberate. They locked onto mine, dark and unreadable, and I felt it immediately, the strange, uncomfortable awareness of being seen. Not glanced at. Not checked out. Seen. Like he was cataloging something about me I hadn't decided to share. "I know," he replied. His voice was calm. Controlled. Low enough that it didn't echo, but solid enough to anchor itself in my chest. There was no edge to it, no threat, but something about it felt dangerous in the quietest way. Like a blade sheathed in velvet. "I just need bread." Something about the way he said need made my pulse trip. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't polite either. It was honest. Unfiltered. As if the word had slipped out before he'd had the chance to dress it up. As if he'd surprised himself by saying it aloud. For a split second, I considered lying. I could have said we were sold out. I could have told him to come back later. I could have pointed at the hours sign and waited for him to leave. I should have told him to leave. I should have locked the door behind him and pretended this moment never happened. Instead, something in me stalled. My feet didn't move. My hand tightened around the edge of the counter. My eyes flicked, traitorous, to the cooling rack behind me where the loaf sat steaming and whole. Why was I hesitating? Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the way his gaze never wavered, never pressured, just waited. Or maybe it was the quiet, stupid part of me that always softened when someone needed something and didn't know how to ask properly. Without trusting myself to speak again, I turned back to the counter. The bread knife felt heavier than usual in my hand. I sliced into the nearest loaf, the crust crackling softly, steam curling up and brushing my face. The smell intensified, warm, rich, alive. My fingers trembled as I wrapped it, the paper crinkling too loudly in the silence. I told myself I was just doing my job. Nothing more. When I turned back and held it out to him, our hands brushed. Just for a second. That was it. That tiny, accidental touch. But my body reacted like I'd stepped too close to a flame. Heat flared up my arm, sharp and sudden. My chest tightened, breath hitching before I could stop it. I hated myself for it immediately. Hated the awareness. Hated how alive I felt over something so small. I tried to pull back too fast. He didn't. He noticed. I know he did. His jaw flexed almost imperceptibly, like he was clenching down on a reaction. His fingers lingered a fraction longer than necessary before letting go, and when his eyes met mine again, there was something different there. Something alert. Something cautious. Like he'd felt it too. How much? He asked. The question grounded me just enough to remind me where I was. Who I was supposed to be. A baker. A woman with rent due and no room for distraction. It's on the house, I said. The words were out before I could stop them. I stared at him immediately, shocked at myself. My stomach dropped. Why did I do that? Why did I always do that, give when I couldn't afford to, bend when I should stand firm? Why was I like this? His brows knit together slightly, like I'd just violated some unspoken rule. He didn't reach for the bread right away. Instead, he studied me then, really studied me. Not my body. Not my face alone. Me. Like he was trying to decide whether I was brave or stupid. Or maybe something worse, something familiar. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, wrapping around us. I became painfully aware of the flour smudge on my cheek, the loose strand of hair sticking to my neck, the way my apron was frayed at the edges. I waited for judgment. For dismissal. For him to take advantage of the offer. Instead, he shook his head once, slow and decisive. I'll pay you back, he said quietly. There was weight in his words. Certainty. Not a promise meant to charm. A statement. Like a fact already written. I always do. Something about that unsettled me more than if he'd argued. He took the bread then, careful not to touch me again, and for a second I thought he might say something else. Ask my name. Say thank you. Smile. He didn't. He turned and walked out just as quietly as he'd come in. The bell rang again, sharp and final. I stood there long after the sound faded, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The bakery felt too empty suddenly. Too quiet. Like something had been taken with him, something I hadn't known I was holding. My hands were still shaking. I pressed my palm flat against the counter, breathing in the smell of bread, grounding myself in the only thing that made sense. That was nothing, I told myself. A stranger. A moment. That's all. That should have been the end. And yet, even as I turned back to my work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already begun, something I hadn't agreed to, something I hadn't planned for, something that had slipped into my life as quietly as the bell above the door. But he came back the next morning. I knew it before I saw him. There was a shift in the air that I was starting to recognize, a heaviness, a quiet pressure that settled into the room like an uninvited thought. The bell above the door rang, soft this time, almost polite, and my shoulders stiffened before my mind caught up. I didn't look up right away. I told myself it was coincidence. Bakeries had regulars. Men needed breakfast. The city was small, patterns overlapped. There was nothing special about a man returning for bread. Still, my fingers slowed as I kneaded dough. My breath went shallow. When I finally lifted my head, he was already there. Same dark coat. Same stillness. Same way of standing like the room belonged to him without him having to claim it. He didn't lean against the counter or check his phone like everyone else. He just waited, eyes steady, unreadable, fixed loosely on me like he wasn't staring but also wasn't not. Always early. Always silent. "Good morning," I said automatically, hating how my voice softened around the edges. He nodded once. Not a greeting. More like acknowledgement. "Same?" I asked, gesturing toward the bread rack. "Yes." Just one word. Calm. Certain. I wrapped the loaf without asking questions I didn't want answers to. When I slid it across the counter, he paid this time, exact change, already counted, placed neatly like he'd planned it the night before. "I said I'd pay you back," he said quietly, meeting my eyes for half a second longer than necessary. Something warm flickered in my chest. Something dangerous. He left without another word. I stood there, staring at the coins, annoyed with myself for noticing the way his fingers never shook, for replaying the sound of his voice in my head while the dough threatened to overproof. And then he came back the next day. Earlier. I was still unlocking the door, keys clinking too loudly in the quiet street, when I saw him standing across the road. Not pacing. Not watching the windows. Just there. As if he'd always been there and I was the one arriving late to something prearranged. "You don't have to wait," I said, forcing a lightness I didn't feel. "I'll be a minute." "I know," he replied. Again, that calm. That patience that felt earned, not practiced. Inside, I moved faster than necessary. My pulse wouldn't settle. I told myself to stop imagining things, stop assigning meaning to routine. But when I handed him the bread, he paused. "You burned your hand yesterday," he said. It wasn't a question. My stomach dipped. What?" "On the oven," he added, eyes dropping briefly to my wrist. "You flinched." I stared at him, caught off guard. "It's fine." "It's nothing." He nodded, but his jaw tightened like he didn't like that answer. "Be careful," he said, softer than before. And just like that, he left again. The next morning, the pattern continued. He didn't linger. He didn't push. He didn't ask questions that crossed lines. But he noticed things, tiny, unsettling things that made me feel too visible. The way I yawned into my sleeve when I hadn't slept. The way my hands shook when the register jammed. The way I took my coffee black, no sugar, despite the chalkboard special screaming caramel and foam. "How do you know that?" I asked one morning, half laughing, half defensive, when he placed a coffee cup beside his bread. "You never touch the sugar," he said simply. It shouldn't have mattered. It did. Always watching me like I was a puzzle he didn't expect to care about. I started timing my mornings around him without meaning to. Brushing my hair twice instead of once. Cleaning the counter a little more thoroughly before he arrived. Hating myself for noticing when he didn't come exactly on time. Why was I doing this? I learned his name by accident. It was late afternoon, the slow hour when sunlight slanted through the front window and painted everything gold. I was wiping down the counter when voices drifted in from outside, low, hurried, edged with something sharp. I froze. Two men stood near the bakery window, unaware of me just feet away. "That's him," one muttered, glancing down the street. "The boss." I leaned closer to the glass, heart thudding. "You don't look him in the eye if you value your life," the other replied. "Man like that doesn't forgive." They laughed quietly, nervously, like people laughing to convince themselves they weren't afraid. My stomach dropped. Boss. Mafia boss. The word slammed into me, cold and heavy, rearranging everything I thought I understood. I stepped back from the window, palms slick with sweat. The bakery suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I replayed every interaction, every quiet look, every careful word. Had I been flirting with danger without knowing it? Had I already crossed a line I couldn't uncross? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Customers talked, I nodded. The register rang, I moved. But my mind was elsewhere, echoing with whispers and warnings and the image of his steady eyes. That night, I went home and stared at my ceiling. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge and the distant noise of traffic. Unopened bills sat on the counter, their corners curling. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check my phone. I just lay there, hands folded on my chest, trying to convince myself this was ridiculous. I was a baker. A nobody. A woman trying to survive after a breakup that had left me with empty cupboards and trust issues I didn't know how to name. A woman who'd learned the hard way that wanting someone didn't mean they'd stay. Men like him didn't notice women like me. Men like him didn't stand patiently in bakeries at dawn. They didn't remember small things. They didn't lower their voices when they spoke. So why did he? Why did he remember how I took my coffee? Why did he ask if my hand had healed after I burned it, his eyes flicking to my wrist like he'd been thinking about it long after he'd left? Why did he wait outside until I locked up some evenings, pretending it was coincidence, pretending he wasn't making sure I got to my car safely? "You don't have to do that," I told him once, keys clutched between my fingers. "I know," he replied. "I want to." The simplicity of it unsettled me more than any grand gesture could have. Every time he said my name, something inside me cracked open. He said it carefully. Like it mattered. Like it carried weight. I hated how much I wanted him. I hated how my body leaned toward him even as my mind screamed danger. Hated the way my heart betrayed me with every quiet kindness, every restrained look. I told myself to stop. To draw lines. To remember what I'd overheard. But each morning, when the bell rang and he stepped inside, all my resolve softened, worn down by the slow, steady ache of something I hadn't planned for and didn't know how to refuse. The complication came crashing down one evening when my friend Lena pulled me aside. It wasn't dramatic at first. No shouting. No accusations. Just the way her hand closed tightly around my wrist as I stepped out back to take a breath, the alley smelling faintly of rain and garbage and old brick. Her grip was firm enough to hurt, firm enough to make me look at her properly. Her face was pale. Serious in a way I hadn't seen since the night she helped me pack boxes after my ex left without saying goodbye. "You need to stop this," she whispered urgently. "Not slow down. Not be careful. Stop." The word landed like a slap. I tried to laugh it off, because that was easier than admitting my chest was already tight. "Stop what?" I asked, too lightly. She glanced toward the bakery door, then back at me, lowering her voice even more. "Don't do that. You know exactly what I'm talking about." My mouth went dry. "You think I don't see him?" she continued. "The way he watches you? The way you look when he walks in? Lena. Do you know who he is?" she cut in. I didn't answer fast enough. Her eyes flashed. People disappear around men like him. The alley felt suddenly too narrow, the walls closing in. The sounds of the city dulled, like I'd been shoved underwater. I know, I said. The words came out quieter than I meant. Smaller. My voice shook anyway. I know. She searched my face, frustration and fear warring there. Then why are you still letting him come around? I didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound stupid. Because he was kind. Because he noticed me. Because he made me feel seen in a life where I'd felt invisible for so long. None of that felt safe to say out loud. So why couldn't I walk away? Lena asked softly, like she already knew. I swallowed. Looked down at the ground. Because every time I try, I don't. She closed her eyes briefly, like that hurt her more than anger would have. I'm scared for you, she said. I'm not trying to control you. Please. Be careful. I will, I lied. She let go of my wrist, but the imprint of her fingers stayed, burning there long after she walked away. So why couldn't I walk away? I asked myself that question all evening as I moved through the bakery on autopilot. I wiped counters that were already clean. Recounted the register twice. Jumped every time the bell rang, only to feel both relief and disappointment when it wasn't him. By the time the rain started, my nerves were shot. The night it rained, he finally broke. It started slow, the way storms always do in this city. A light tapping against the windows, barely noticeable, then heavier, louder, until the glass blurred and the streetlights smeared into glowing streaks of yellow and white. The bakery was quiet. Closed sign flipped. Chairs stacked. The smell of bread had faded into something cooler, emptier. I was wiping the counter when I heard footsteps. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Him. He stood just inside the door, rain clinging to his coat, darkening the fabric. Water dripped onto the floor beneath him, a soft, steady rhythm. He didn't move to shake it off. You're still open, he said, though his eyes flicked to the sign. For you? I replied before thinking. I guess I always am. The words hung between us, heavier than they should have been. He stepped closer. Not crowding me. Just close enough that I could smell him, leather, rain, and something deeper beneath it all. Something lonely. Something tired. My heart thudded painfully. He watched me for a long moment, his gaze sharper tonight, more exposed. Like he was deciding something he'd been avoiding. You're afraid of me, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. I inhaled slowly. There was no point lying now. Yes. The honesty surprised us both. And that's the worst part, I added, my voice barely above a whisper. Because it doesn't stop me. Something flickered across his face, pain, maybe. Regret. He exhaled slowly, deeply, like he'd been holding that breath for years. I never meant to pull you into this, he said. The rain beat harder against the windows, punctuating every word. That's why I stayed quiet. My heart slammed against my ribs. Into what? Screamed every instinct I had. Into what? I asked aloud. His phone buzzed. The sound was sharp in the stillness, slicing through the moment like a blade. He glanced down instinctively, then stopped himself. He didn't look at it. That scared me more than if he had. I'm leaving, he said instead. The words didn't make sense at first. They floated there, detached, like they belonged to someone else's life. Tonight. The words hit me harder than any truth could have. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to grip the counter to stay upright. Leaving? I echoed stupidly. What do you mean leaving? His jaw clenched. He turned slightly, putting distance between us that hadn't existed seconds before. Why? I whispered. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than I'd ever heard it. Because wanting you is the most dangerous thing I've ever done. That was the twist. Not that he was dangerous, but that he was running from me. The realization left me dizzy. You don't get to say that like it's romantic, I snapped, anger flaring through the fear. You don't get to scare me and then just leave. He finally looked at me then, really looked at me, and the expression on his face made my anger falter. This isn't a story where people get happy endings, he said quietly. I didn't ask for a story, I shot back. I asked for the truth. He turned away. I should have stopped there. I didn't. I found out the rest by accident. He stepped outside to take the call he'd been avoiding, rain immediately soaking his shoulders. His phone buzzed again on the counter where he'd left it. I wasn't trying to snoop. I swear I wasn't. But the screen lit up. And my name was there. Written in cold, unforgiving text. A message thread open. Unmistakable. She's still around. That's a problem. Handle it, or we will. My stomach turned violently. There was more. Enough to piece together the truth I hadn't wanted to see. Warnings. Threats. A clock ticking down. I felt sick. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep from dropping the phone when I heard the door open again. He froze when he saw my face. You saw it, he said. It wasn't a question. You've been pushing me away, I whispered, tears burning my eyes. Not because you didn't care. But because you do. He closed his eyes briefly, like that confession cost him something. I was trying to keep you safe, he said. The words broke something in me. When I confronted him, my voice broke too. You don't get to decide for me, I said through tears. You don't get to leave without telling me the truth. You don't get to protect me by lying. He stepped closer, hands fisting at his sides, control slipping. You don't understand, he said hoarsely. Then make me understand, I begged. I lose people, he said. The words sounded torn out of him. Everyone I love pays for it. Silence swallowed us whole. The rain roared outside. The lights hummed overhead. My heart felt like it was tearing itself apart between fear and wanting. We stood there, inches apart, everything laid bare and nothing solved. Then he stepped back. Turned. And walked away. The bell rang once more, hollow and final, leaving me alone in the quiet with the truth echoing louder than any threat ever could. The sound didn't fade the way it usually did. It lingered, vibrating in my chest, bouncing off the tiled walls, settling into places inside me that were already cracked. I stood there long after the door had closed, staring at the empty space where he'd been, half expecting him to come back and say he'd forgotten something. Or that he'd changed his mind. Or that this was all a misunderstanding I could still fix if I moved fast enough. But the door stayed shut. The street outside blurred through the glass, rain still falling, people passing, life continuing with cruel indifference. The breakdown nearly broke me too. I didn't collapse dramatically. I didn't scream or throw anything. I just stood there, hands braced against the counter, breathing shallow breaths like my body was afraid to inhale too deeply in case everything shattered at once. When I finally locked up that night, my fingers fumbled with the keys. I dropped them twice. I laughed softly at myself when I finally got the door closed, the sound brittle and unfamiliar. The walk home felt longer than usual. Every shadow felt heavier. Every passing car made me flinch. I told myself it was just exhaustion, just nerves, but deep down, I knew it was the absence. The sudden, brutal quiet where his presence had been. The morning after he walked away, I arrived early. earlier than I ever had before. The sky was still pale, the city not fully awake, the streets smelling faintly of wet pavement and old bread from nearby shops. I unlocked the bakery and stepped inside, flicking on the lights one by one. They hummed to life, bright and unforgiving. I stood behind the counter, hands folded, waiting. Waiting for the bell that never rang. My body betrayed me immediately. My shoulders tensed. My heartbeat sped up. I found myself glancing at the door every few seconds, pretending to organize things that didn't need organizing just to justify looking up again. Any second now, I thought. This was when he usually came. I braced instinctively for his shadow to appear on the frosted glass, for the familiar pause before the bell rang. My chest tightened every time footsteps passed outside, my heart stuttering, hope flaring before sinking again when the footsteps continued on. Not him. Still not him. The realization hit slowly, then all at once. He wasn't coming. Days passed. Then more days. Then weeks. Time stopped behaving the way it used to. Mornings dragged, heavy and reluctant, each one beginning with the same small, stupid hope that today might be different. Nights collapsed into exhaustion so deep I barely dreamed, just sank into sleep like falling into dark water. The bakery kept its rhythm even when I didn't. Dough still rose under warm cloths, patient and forgiving. Ovens still hummed, steady and dependable. Timers still rang when they were supposed to. Customers still came and went, laughing, complaining, flirting, rushing, living lives that felt untouched by the quiet ache that had settled into my chest. They asked how I was. Fine, I said. They commented on the weather. Crazy, right? I replied. They didn't know that every smile cost me something. That every normal interaction felt like acting in a play I hadn't auditioned for. The bakery felt empty without his shadow by the door. Not empty in a loud way. Not the kind of empty you notice immediately. It was subtle. Insidious. The kind that crept up on you when you reached for something familiar and found nothing there. The kind you only recognized after loss had already rearranged your senses. The air felt thinner, like there wasn't quite enough of it. The mornings felt colder, even when the ovens were blazing. Even the bell sounded different, too sharp, too eager, like it was calling out for someone who no longer answered. Sometimes it rang and my heart jumped anyway. Sometimes it rang and I had to look away for a second before turning around, just to prepare myself. I baked on autopilot. Measure. Mix. Knead. Wait. The rhythm of it became my lifeline. My hands remembered what my heart didn't want to face. Muscle memory carried me through when my thoughts threatened to spiral. I focused on textures, temperatures, timing, anything tangible, anything controllable. Flour between my fingers. Warmth against my palms. The slow, patient rise of dough. I moved through the motions with a dull precision, doing everything right without really being present. My body showed up even when my mind drifted back to him without permission. I replayed conversations I hadn't finished. The pauses where I should have spoken. The questions I hadn't asked. The moments I'd mistaken for safety instead of warning. I replayed words I hadn't said. Stay. Tell me everything. I'm not as fragile as you think. And always, always, the way his eyes had looked that last night. Torn. Determined. Afraid. Afraid not of me, but of what loving me might cost. That thought hurt the most. I hated how much space he still occupied in my mind. He showed up everywhere without trying. In the quiet mornings. In the empty doorway. In the way my coffee tasted wrong now, like something essential was missing. Some days I was angry. Angry at him for leaving without giving me the choice. Angry at myself for letting him matter so much, so fast. Angry at the world for making love feel like a risk instead of a refuge. On those days, I scrubbed counters harder than necessary. Slammed trays a little louder. Let irritation simmer just beneath my skin because anger felt better than longing. Other days, I was just tired. Bone-deep tired. Tired of missing someone I wasn't sure I was allowed to miss. Tired of waking up with his absence sitting heavy in my chest. Tired of pretending this hadn't changed me. Lena noticed. "You look thinner," she said one afternoon, leaning against the counter, eyes sharp and worried. "I've been busy," I replied. She didn't push. Just nodded, lips pressed together like she was holding back 100 things she wanted to say. At night, alone in my apartment, the silence was worse. There was nothing to distract me there. No ovens. No customers. No bells. Just me and the echo of what might have been. I lay awake replaying his voice, the restraint in it, the way he'd said my name like it mattered. I wondered where he was. If he was safe. If he thought about me too, or if walking away had been easier for him than staying ever could have been. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. And admitting that didn't make me weak, it made me honest. Somewhere between one batch of bread and the next, between one quiet morning and another, something inside me shifted. Not healed. Not fixed. But steadied. I began to understand that loving someone didn't mean losing myself. That fear didn't get to dictate every choice. That I could miss him and still stand on my own 2 feet. The pain didn't disappear. But it softened. And in that space, between loss and acceptance, I kept baking, kept breathing, kept showing up, even when my heart lagged behind. Because even broken things, I was learning, could still rise. Other days, I was just tired. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes. Not the kind of day off cures. It was a deeper exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones when your heart has been carrying weight it doesn't know how to put down. I woke up tired. I went to bed tired. I moved through my days like I was conserving energy for something I couldn't name. Tired of missing someone I wasn't sure I was allowed to miss. That part hurt more than I wanted to admit. Because missing him felt wrong, like a betrayal of my own survival instincts. Like admitting I missed him meant admitting I'd been reckless with my heart. So I swallowed it down, kept it quiet, let it sit where no one could question it. Tired of explaining his absence to Lena when she asked gently, "Has he been around?" She always asked like that. Gently. Like she already knew the answer and didn't want to bruise me by hearing it out loud. "No," I'd say, forcing a shrug. "Guess he found another bakery." She never smiled at that. Just nodded slowly, eyes searching my face like she was reading between lines I refused to speak. Tired of pretending this hadn't changed me. Because it had. It had changed the way I listened for footsteps. The way I watched doors. The way my chest tightened at quiet moments. It had changed the way I thought about safety and choice and how easily 2 people could orbit each other without ever really colliding. But something else happened in that quiet. Something slow. Not a lightning bolt. Not a revelation. Just a series of small decisions I barely noticed at first. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and paid my rent on time for the first time in months. No frantic reshuffling. No bargaining with myself. No late fee looming like punishment. I stared at the confirmation screen longer than necessary, a strange pride blooming in my chest. Another night, I realized I hadn't skipped dinner. I'd cooked something simple, eaten it without distraction, without rushing. My body had thanked me in quiet ways, steadier hands, clearer thoughts. I started taking longer walks home instead of rushing straight to my apartment to avoid my thoughts. I let the air cool my skin. Let the city move around me. I learned which streets felt safe, which corners smelled like rain and bread and summer heat. I noticed things again. I noticed myself again. I learned how to sit with the fear instead of running from it. That was the hardest part. Because fear had always been loud for me. Urgent. Convincing. It told me to avoid, to hide, to leave first so I couldn't be left. Sitting with it felt like standing still while a storm gathered overhead, trusting it wouldn't destroy me. Learning that love didn't mean disappearing into fear took time. It meant facing uncomfortable truths I'd never wanted to name. That I'd been willing to shrink myself for connection. That part of me believed danger was the price of being seen. That chaos had always felt familiar, and familiarity had masqueraded as chemistry. In the stillness, I unpacked that belief slowly, carefully, like fragile glass. I held it up to the light. Examined the cracks. Asked myself who had taught me that love had to hurt to be real. Asked myself why calm once felt boring and now felt sacred. I didn't rush the answers. I grew stronger in the quiet. Not louder. Not harder. Just steadier. I stood straighter behind the counter. I spoke more clearly. I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. I trusted my instincts again, not the panicked ones, but the steady ones that whispered instead of shouted. And then, one morning, the bell rang again. The sound cut through the bakery like a held breath released. It was sharp and familiar and impossible. I froze. My hands were dusted with flour, palms white, fingers stiff around the edge of the counter. The oven hummed behind me, warm and steady, oblivious to the way my entire body had gone rigid. My first thought wasn't hope. It was reflexive pain. Sharp. Immediate. My chest tightened so fast it felt like I'd been struck. My breath caught before my mind could catch up, before I could remind myself not to expect anything, before I could tell my heart to calm down. I stayed still. For half a second. For a full second. Then I looked up anyway. Because some habits are stronger than resolve. He stood there. The sight of him hit me like memory and reality colliding at once. Tired. Not just physically, though that was there too, but the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes. Scarred in ways I hadn't noticed before. Lines near his eyes that hadn't been there before. A stiffness in his shoulders, like he carried weight differently now, like he'd learned what it meant to put things down and pick new ones up. But his eyes were softer. Still dark. Still intense. Still capable of quiet gravity. But no longer guarded in the same way. Like something inside him had finally stopped bracing for impact. For a moment, neither of us moved. The bakery felt impossibly quiet. Too quiet. Like the world had leaned in to listen. The hum of the oven seemed louder. The clock ticked. The smell of bread hung between us, warm and grounding. Everything narrowed to the space between us. Thick with everything we hadn't said. Everything we hadn't resolved. Everything that had grown in silence. "You're early," I said finally. The words came out calm. My voice didn't shake. That realization surprised me almost as much as seeing him. He almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth twitched, like the expression was still unfamiliar, like he hadn't practiced it enough. "I always was," he replied. That familiar calm was there, but it had changed. It wasn't controlled in the same way. It didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt earned. Like something he'd fought for rather than something he hid behind. "I didn't know if you'd still be here," he added. The honesty in that caught me off guard. I swallowed. "I didn't know if you'd come back." There it was. The truth, laid gently between us. He stepped closer. Slow. Deliberate. Not assuming. Not demanding. Just moving forward like he was giving me space to stop him if I wanted to. I didn't. "I dismantled everything," he said. The words landed heavily, but there was no drama in them. No pride. No self-pity. Just truth. Just exhaustion. Just the weight of choices made and paid for. I chose a different life. My breath caught despite myself. The part of me that had spent weeks learning how not to hope flinched hard. My chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with something fragile and dangerous, possibility. For you? I asked. The question slipped out before I could stop it. Vulnerable. Honest. Terrifying. He shook his head gently. For me. No hesitation. No performance. No attempt to charm or convince. Just clarity. But, he added, quieter now, his voice lowering like he was afraid to scare something delicate away, I hoped, maybe yes. The word hoped hung in the air. Not a promise. Not a demand. An offering. And I stood there, flower-dusted and steady, heart no longer racing, no longer hiding, realizing how much had changed, not just in him, but in me. That single word, hoped, undid me more than any grand declaration could have. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't certainty. It was an offering. I stepped closer, heart steady for the first time since I'd known him. Not racing. Not panicking. Just present. I'm not afraid anymore, I said. The truth of it surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. But I won't be saved, I continued. I stand beside. I held his gaze as I said it, not daring him to leave, not begging him to stay. Just stating the terms of who I had become. Something in his expression shifted, relief, respect, something like gratitude. He nodded, eyes shining. I wouldn't want it any other way, he said. That was the decision. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Just clear. Not a fairy tale. No sweeping music. No guarantees. Not a rescue. No one pulling anyone out of darkness alone. Just two imperfect people choosing each other honestly, with eyes open and feet planted firmly in their own lives. I turned back to the counter, hands steady as I wrapped a loaf of bread. It was warm and whole, the crust cracked just right, the smell filling the space between us like something familiar and safe. When I handed it to him, our fingers brushed again. This time, I didn't flinch. As I watched him take it, really looked at him, at us, I realized something that still stays with me. Sometimes love doesn't walk in loud and hungry. Sometimes it waits quietly. Until you're brave enough to meet it.